Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 27 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the Utah Mammoth and won by a score of 6-3. This was the third and final matchup between these two teams this season. The first one took place just 4 games into the year for the Sharks, and coincidentally, they lost that game 6-3. And then a couple of weeks ago, they faced off against the Utah Mammoth again, and they won that one 3-2 in overtime. And so this was the third and final matchup to actually decide the season series between these two teams. But more importantly, was that these teams were actually exactly tied in the standings coming into tonight, both with 27 points, which actually put them within striking distance of a playoff spot. In fact, the winner of this game would find themselves in a playoff position by the end of the night. And with the Sharks claiming the 2 points, that is exactly where they are. We are December 1st. This is almost 2 months into the season, and the San Jose Sharks are in a playoff spot. I don't think anybody would have believed you had you said this back on October 1st, and yet here we are. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that because there are some teams that have a game or even a couple of games in hand over San Jose, and for instance, the Chicago Blackhawks actually have a slightly higher points percentage, but still, despite all the faults that the Sharks have had this season, their lack of scoring as of late, their inconsistent at best defense, and the fact that they have had to rely so extremely heavily on their goaltender this season, the Sharks are currently in a playoff spot, which does deserve a ton of praise. Now, when it comes to specifically this game, I would say that the Sharks played pretty well. They scored 6 goals, and it was obviously extremely exciting, as it's always fun when the team scores some goals here. I won't say that they were completely dominant over Utah, but they do deserve the victory that they got here tonight, and they were much more lethal in terms of capitalizing on the chances and even generating those individual chances themselves compared to the Mammoth here tonight. Now, this one starts off with a Tyler Toffoli goal, a very important one for himself because he had not scored in a while, and that is something that he is relied on to do. That made it 1-0 San Jose early, and then it is Pavel Regenda scoring his first goal as a San Jose Shark in his first game as a San Jose Shark, coming on the power play, interestingly enough, and that makes it 2-0 Sharks. The Mammoth would respond with a goal from Lawson Krause. That would bring it to within 1, and the details of this goal are pretty interesting. I won't talk about them now. I'll get to it more when I start discussing the Sharks defenseman later on in this video, just to know that I'm not glossing over this one completely. But then the Sharks are able to get the lead, or the 2-goal lead back with another one from Toffoli, this one coming right off of an offensive zone faceoff, and then it is responded to with a goal from Peterka, who has been a Shark killer this season, and that made it 3-2, still a lead for the Sharks after a back and forth 20 minutes in the first period. Now, the second period for San Jose as of late has been a bit of a struggle for them. However, here tonight it was different. They were able to actually balloon their 1-goal lead into a 4-goal lead with goals from Will Smith, Adam Gaudette, and Will Smith again, and it is 6-2 heading into the third period. Now, the last game that these two teams met, the Sharks had a 2-goal lead in the third, and it was, of course, JJ Peterka who scored both goals to actually tie that one, force overtime before the Sharks would come out on top. This time they have double the lead with now 4, and yet not feeling too comfortable still. Us Sharks fans have been burned many times in the past, and even a 4-goal lead doesn't feel all that safe. And indeed, the Utah Mammoth managed to make it at least a little bit kind of nerve-wracking there in the middle parts when they get this shorthanded goal from Lawson Krause and then come oh so close to scoring from JJ Peterka again, as this puck rests pretty much on the goal line before Dmitry Orlov is able to swoop in, knock it into the pads of Askarov, get the whistle. At that point, the Sharks, they seem to kind of get back on the right track. They are able to mostly close out this game pretty cleanly, and it turns into this 6-3 regulation victory for the Sharks. Important, especially with the sort of playoff picture in mind, to not be spotting that extra point this time around to the Utah Mammoth. A clean, or a relatively clean, regulation victory for San Jose. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks' top line. It is Toffoli, Celebrini, and Smith who lead the way here tonight. The Sharks' best line, certainly the most productive as well. Toffoli grabs 4 points. That leads the way here tonight. Smith with 3 and Celebrini with 3 as well. To start off with Macklin Celebrini, he hits multiple milestones in this game. He grabs 3 assists, which now has him leading the entire league in this area. 27 assists, if I am not mistaken, at this moment, or 26, I believe, actually. He is also the second player in the NHL this season to hit the 40-point mark, only trailing a few behind Nathan MacKinnon, who's just obviously been on absolute fire throughout this season. And he is also one of the youngest players to hit 40 points in just 27 games. He joins Sidney Crosby, Wayne Gretzky, and Mario Lemieux as the only teenagers to actually hit that marker in 27 or less games. Quite the company to be mentioned with. And yet what is very interesting about this game here tonight from Celebrini is that in previous games this season, the last 26, I would say about 95% of the time, Celebrini has been the best player on his line. That's not a huge surprise, of course, because Celebrini has been dominating and he is the best player on this team, but it would be nice for others to actually step up in, in certain games here or there. And in the last one against the Vegas Golden Knights, Smith did manage to do so. I had even said that Smith was actually better than Celebrini in that game, but in particular, the third player on that line, whether that's been Kurashev or Toffoli or Eklund, pretty much never, honestly, has actually managed to surpass Celebrini, but that has changed here tonight. I think that you could make an argument that both Toffoli and Smith were ever so marginally better than Celebrini here tonight. It's not saying much because Celebrini was still quite good, but the fact that those two wingers were actually competitive with him and it wasn't just Celebrini having to single-handedly carry the offensive load of this top line, that is a very good thing. And honestly, I don't think there's anybody else happier than Celebrini himself about this fact. We have seen at times throughout this season that he has been trying to do a little bit too much for the San Jose Sharks, feeling as though that he is the guy who has to be the offensive powerhouse on this team, or else they're just not really going to score many goals. And if you go back through the month of November, he had contributed on more than half of the goals that the Sharks had throughout that entire month. That is a completely unsustainable clip for any player, even the best of the best in the entire NHL. Something did have to change, and obviously Celebrini still gets in on 3 of these 6 goals, and many of the which that the Sharks' first line had scored. But the fact that Smith and Toffoli were able to step up in a big way is promising as long as it can carry forward. With Smith, it has been the case for these past few games. For Toffoli, it's a little bit more questionable because obviously this was a huge turnaround for him, but it could be extremely valuable for the San Jose Sharks if this ends up being a bit of a trend. Now, when it comes to Will Smith, I had said that he really began to kind of find his game a bit after that game against the Vancouver Canucks. He had scored a goal there, and that was a big one for his confidence. He finished out that Vancouver game. He was pretty solid for the Sharks. Then against the Vegas Golden Knights the very next day, I thought he was actually the best player on the ice, or at least the best forward on the ice for the Sharks. And here tonight, carries in yet again. He picks up a couple of goals. He is once again one of the Sharks' best forwards, but it's that confidence that you can really see on display on the 2 goals that he ends up scoring, because he shows off his tremendous amount of skill on both of these. The first one, he performs the nice toe drag move between the legs of defenseman Nate Schmidt. And mind you, Nate Schmidt is a defending Stanley Cup champion with the Florida Panthers, and he was a little under the radar, I would say, because he was actually extremely solid for the Panthers during that Stanley Cup run. And then he is able to get through the stick of Brandon Tanev, not maybe as accoladed as a player like Schmidt, but still a very solid veteran player, and he's able to get past Vitek Vanacek with that shot. And then on the second one, he has a nice toe drag against Mikhail Sergachev, a 2-time Stanley Cup champion, really incredible defenseman with the Tampa Bay Lightning a few years ago. And so Will Smith making both of these players just look completely silly and as though they just stepped onto the NHL ice for the first time in their careers. That's how just confident Will Smith is feeling with the puck right now. And this was a very solid game from him. There was a little bit of a kind of mistake, maybe somewhat of a miscommunication on this shorthanded goal, as he ends up kind of overcovering with John Klingberg, and they completely leave Lawson Krause available in front of the net to get this shorthanded goal. So a small bump there for sure, but otherwise a really kind of hands down great game for Smith. And then when it comes to Tyler Toffoli, I mentioned earlier on, extremely important that he was able to get this goal here. The hope now, of course, and perhaps the 2 goals is going to kind of point towards that. The hope now here is that he can grab these 2 goals, hold on to them, and then sort of parlay it into even more goals as we move forward. We have said constantly that he has not looked like the same player completely from last season to this one. Those first 26 games, he maybe had a couple of good performances, and more often than not, he's been just like a slightly positive or slightly negative impact player, but not super noticeable on the ice. Now, could that have really changed in just a couple of days' time? I guess we'll see. Hopefully, Toffoli can sort of have like a new month, new me type of perspective here moving forward in December. We shall see, but obviously 4 points is fantastic for him. When it comes to the Sharks' second line here, we have Eklund, Wenberg, and Gaudette, and it was an interesting game, I would say, for this second line. I actually thought they had a lot of very high moments. In fact, in terms of just offensive possession in the offensive zone, I actually thought this was probably the Sharks' best line of the night. They were able to actually cycle the puck quite consistently across like 4 or 5 different shifts in this game, which might not sound like a massive accomplishment for most teams, but for a Sharks team that has struggled to do that with any sort of consistency whatsoever, this is actually quite good. However, at the same time, this second line did also have, 3 or 4 shifts where they got caught pretty significantly in the defensive zone, had some issues there. So it was not a super positive game for this second line, but there were a lot of important achievements that they were able to accomplish here that hopefully can be built upon, because we know when it comes to players like William Eklund and Alex Wenberg that they are pretty solid in their own end. And even if they had a couple of issues here tonight, those are things that can be cleaned up. What you were really looking for was more offensive pressure. That's what they were able to bring, and that is promising for a second line that really has not been much of an offensive factor throughout a good chunk of this season. When it comes to the individual standpoint for all 3 of these players, I thought Eklund did some very fantastic sort of cycle and forechecking work in the offensive zone throughout this game. He definitely looks a lot more engaged, also thanks to the couple of goals that he's picked up in these last 2 games against Vegas and against Vancouver. Again, speaking to how important confidence is for these players. Alex Wenberg, I thought, was pretty good here tonight as well, and I once again really liked the energy that Adam Gaudette brought. And this was even somewhat of a surprise because we didn't even know if Adam Gaudette would be in the lineup for this game. He was a game time decision. Apparently he has some sort of illness. You would not have been able to tell with the game that he put up here tonight. Grabs this goal on an extremely nice backhand. He actually probably could have had another goal at a later point in this game. And so Gaudette playing very well in a top 6 position, not something I thought I would be saying. When it comes to the Sharks' third line here, we have Kurashev, Dellandrea, and Graf. They didn't really get into the fun as much when it comes to an offensive perspective. I thought defensively they were mostly pretty good. There were like 1 or 2 shifts in particular. I thought Graf had some struggles here tonight, but not anything too serious. Offensively, they maybe had 1 or 2 shifts in the offensive zone. They were able to get something going, but this was generally a relatively low event line for the San Jose Sharks, which is not a terrible thing, at least when the first and the second line were rolling as much as they were. If they can actually provide that type of defensive backbone, it's still pretty decent. It's just you would like to see a little bit more offense coming from the 3 of them, but it wasn't a terrible game, I would say. When it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, here we have a new player in the lineup. As I mentioned earlier on, he scored a goal here tonight. That is Pavel Regenda, replacing Zach Ostapchuk on this fourth line. Now, I had mentioned in the last game that we likely weren't going to see any changes to the 12-man forward group until either Jeff Skinner or Michael Misa returned from injury, but that does not end up being the case. The Sharks do make a decision, and this is not because they decided to waive Nick Leddy or trade away a different defenseman. Instead, they decide to kick the can down the road, say that they'll solve the problem at a later date, and Vincent DeHarnay is put onto the injured reserve. This does create a roster spot, and the Sharks call up a forward here, and I think this was probably because of the fact that they didn't know if Gaudette would start, and so if Gaudette did have to miss tonight's game, they could have Regenda and Ostapchuk play here, but because Gaudette plays, they have Regenda so that they don't call him up for no reason, have him take the spot over Ostapchuk on that fourth line. Now, the ultimate question is why Regenda? Why is he the one getting called up? If you take a look at the San Jose Barracuda, there have been 2 players who have been real standout performers for them on the forward side of things, that being Igor Chernyshov and Quinton Musty. They have put up tremendous point totals this season from a rookie AHL perspective amongst the league leaders in that particular area, and so it would seem as though they would be deserving of that type of call-up, but I sort of understand the perspective of Ryan Warsofsky. The major thing being the fact that this place in the lineup was likely going to be on this fourth line, and do we really want Chernyshov or Musty to be making their NHL debuts on a fourth line with Ryan Reeves and Barclay Goodrow? Not really. And when it comes to Regenda, while he hasn't been putting up really exceptional numbers in the AHL this season, if we go back to the preseason, we know that he had a very good performance there. He came pretty close, at least in my eyes, to actually being able to make it onto the NHL starting roster with the Sharks, and so it is a kind of delayed reward here getting the call up, and it did work out rather well because, of course, like I said, he scored a goal and even came pretty close to scoring a second one on a kind of partial breakaway opportunity. Now, it wasn't all great for Regenda. There was one moment in the defensive zone where he got completely caught flat-footed, and that gave an extremely good chance for the Utah Mammoth to actually score a goal. But besides that, I thought Regenda was mostly positive here for the San Jose Sharks. A strong first game for him. We'll see what the Sharks decide to do with the lineup moving forward in the next game. When it comes to his two line mates, generally this fourth line I didn't actually think started this game out particularly well at all, but they did finish pretty strong. Ryan Reeves, I thought, again, like I said, not a good start, decent enough finish. With Barclay Goodrow, what I will say is that he does end up getting called for a couple of penalties here. Now, the validity of these penalties is up for debate. The first one I thought was pretty clear-cut hooking. The second one, it kind of could have gone either way. I didn't really see it there, but I guess by the letter of the law, it sort of was hooking. The problem here for Barclay Goodrow is that his major use to the Sharks lineup is on the penalty kill. And so if he's taking 2 penalties, that's not a very good thing, obviously. And so he needs to be staying out of the box if he actually wants to be able to make use of the major asset that he actually has in this Sharks lineup, because he's certainly not playing for his even strength capability. Despite the fact that he has been better than last season, that was not a particularly high bar to clear. It is still the penalty killing why he is here, and if he's in the box, he's not on the ice. When it comes to the Sharks defensively, as I mentioned just a bit earlier, Vincent Desharnais put onto the injured reserve, which explains why he did not get either of the games against Vancouver or Vegas, which certainly makes a ton of sense because he has been very solid for the Sharks this season, so there must have been some sort of reason for why he wasn't getting into the lineup. The other 2 scratches, of course, are Iorio and Leddy. Not going to see any complaints from me on either of those 2 players. Leddy, I was kind of hoping he wouldn't even be here on the roster anymore, but at the very least, he's not actually dressed for this game. When it comes to the actual lineup, we had the top pairing of Orlov and Liljegren, but this is obviously a very good time to mention that the pairings didn't really maintain a certain form throughout this game. We saw pretty quickly that Orlov actually ended up with Mukhamadullin and Liljegren was ending up with Sam Dickinson, but more importantly than that, the Sharks ended up shortening the bench here from a defensive standpoint, though I'll get to that a little bit later when I arrive at the third pairing. Instead, we'll start off, again, like I said, Orlov and Liljegren. This was an important bounce-back game for both of these players. They had not played very well at all against the Vegas Golden Knights. Liljegren in particular struggled actually throughout the entirety of this last week against Vegas, Vancouver, and Colorado. And so I had mentioned that he was a bit of a coin flip type of player. Sometimes you get him at his best, sometimes you get him at his extreme worst. Well, tonight, the Sharks land on heads with Liljegren. I don't think it was a perfect game, but I do think he was a good bit better, a lot more engaged. I actually kind of enjoyed the pairing of him with Sam Dickinson. It didn't have too many shifts in this game, but when they were on the ice together, it looked all right. And so Liljegren, it was an improvement for sure from him in this game. When it comes to his defensive partner, Dmitry Orlov, also a pretty big improvement for Orlov. His big issue throughout much of this season, usually when he's playing poorly, it is because of his puck management. He's just giving too many pucks away. He really limited that here tonight. I thought he was a lot more locked in, which was nice to see and is, of course, very important for this team. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing, we have Ferraro and Klingberg. Klingberg, of course, remains a very interesting player to talk about. We really got to see the dichotomy of Klingberg as a player very, very early on in this one. I think it was only like a minute and a half into this game. The Sharks have him on for an offensive zone shift, and he makes actually a couple of plays to help keep the pressure going and to help keep the puck in the offensive zone and keep the Sharks attacking in that area. And that is the value that John Klingberg can actually bring to the lineup. And while it's not anything extremely impressive, it is something that not that many Sharks defensemen can do on a consistent basis. Like, we have occasionally seen it from Orlov, we have occasionally seen it from Dickinson, maybe Ferraro at times, maybe Liljegren at times, but it is all very, very few and far between. Klingberg can do it at least slightly more often, but then on the very, very next shift, Klingberg finds himself in the defensive zone and he makes a couple of mistakes that allow more pressure to continue from the Utah side. And so it is this give and take type of relationship for John Klingberg. Much throughout this season, the take has been a lot more than the give, as in he has been a lot more negative than he has been positive. Here tonight, it did go the opposite way. I think there were a lot of errors in Klingberg's game for sure. I'm sure if you were going to count like the NHL giveaway count is usually a lot less reliable. I feel like they don't usually have the exact number. I think if you wanted to count a little bit more aggressively, you could probably get like 4 or 5 giveaways in his own zone from John Klingberg, but there were enough positives to kind of overrule that at least a little bit, especially in a San Jose Sharks victory. So I am mostly satisfied with how John Klingberg played here tonight. What is interesting is that Ryan Warsofsky seems to have an extremely kind of forgiving relationship, I'll say, with John Klingberg, because we know that he was healthy scratched a couple of times pretty recently, but the moment that John Klingberg steps into the lineup and showcases himself to be at least somewhat playable, Warsofsky really begins to lean on him, despite the fact that the Sharks were not chasing in this game, because they had somewhat of a justification for it last time against Vegas, where the Sharks were trailing by a goal for the entirety of the third period. And so if you believe that Klingberg is your best offensive defenseman, it kind of makes sense to play him a decent bit, even if I don't necessarily think that is the case. However, here tonight, the Sharks had the lead for the entirety of the third period, and Klingberg still was leaned on quite heavily, only less ice time than Dmitry Orlov, but more than anybody else on this team. And so Klingberg is a player who Ryan Warsofsky seems to really appreciate, and that's not much of a secret. When it comes to his defensive partner, Mario Ferraro, I thought this was, once again, a pretty steady game from Ferraro. I don't think it was his best that we have seen. I didn't notice Ferraro a ton, which is a positive in the sense that it means he wasn't making a ton of errors, but it is a negative that he wasn't standing out in an extremely positive light, but still all around a pretty solid game for Ferraro. And then we get to the Sharks' bottom defensive pairing here. We have Sam Dickinson and Shakir Mukhamadullin, which is the perfect time to discuss this first goal that the Utah Mammoth scored here tonight, the one from Lawson Krause, because it is a set of mistakes from both of these players. It starts off in the offensive zone. Shakir Mukhamadullin bobbles the puck at the blue line. Now, you could look at this and be pretty harsh. I don't actually think this is the major mistake for Mukhamadullin, and I really believe it is like the exhibit A of why, even if a player is comfortable playing on their offside, why it is not an optimal situation. Because imagine if Mukhamadullin was a right-handed defenseman in this spot, he has this puck along the boards. Instead of having to bring it to his forehand, he would be able to immediately have it on his forehand and actually make a quick decision. But because he is a lefty, he has to grab it on his backhand, bring it to the forehand. This takes, a half second, 3/4 of a second, but things move so fast at the NHL level that the defenseman is now a lot closer to pressuring you, and it puts Mukhamadullin in a slightly more hesitant position. Obviously, the mistakes comes from that hesitation, and he does not make a good play, but that's not why I'm as critical about this situation for him. Instead, it is because on the way back, he is one-on-one with his man, Michael Carcone, and he is not able to get stick on puck. He is not able to push this player off the puck either, and in the end, he even ends up losing body position in front of the net and giving Carcone a great chance to either take a shot or make a move or pass the puck, which is what he ends up doing to Lawson Krause. This is not good for Mukhamadullin. Carcone is neither a player who is extremely skilled, like a Mitch Marner, which is what we saw in the last game against Vegas, nor is he a player who is particularly big and strong. Mukhamadullin has multiple inches on him and multiple pounds as well. This should be a battle that he is capable of winning, and he was unable to do that in this situation. And that not only puts his team in a tough spot, or himself in a tough spot, but it puts his team in a tough spot as well. And in particular, his goaltender and his defensive partner, Sam Dickinson, which is where the next mistake ends up coming in. Sam Dickinson, his role in this position is to stick with his man, Lawson Krause, and prevent him from getting an easy attempt on net. But Sam Dickinson, while he is sticking with him, when he sees Mukhamadullin actually losing this battle, he tries to kind of compensate for that and attempt to do too much. He spreads himself too thin, thinking that, okay, I'm going to get my stick on Carcone so that he's not able to, take an extra second to try and make a play, and then I'm also going to be able to block that pass. But because he is spreading himself too thin, in the end, he ends up doing neither of these two things, and he just doesn't actually make the good enough defensive play here, sticking with Krause and preventing him from taking this shot. And it is a moment where Dickinson simply just needs to have more trust in his defensive partner. And this is what I would call a rookie mistake. I find that sometimes calling things a rookie mistake is over-exaggerated. Like sometimes you'll say a player make a defensive zone giveaway and someone will say, oh, that's a rookie mistake. But I've seen John Klingberg have 1,000 defensive zone giveaways. It's something that veterans will do as well. But in this spot, it is a situation where Dickinson feels as though he has to be the hero. He has to be the guy who makes the hero play. And so instead of just keeping it safe, sticking with his man and trusting Mukhamadullin to recover in time or trusting his goaltender to be able to come up with the save. He tries to do too much and it ends up in the back of his net. But what ends up transpiring from this situation is, as I said earlier on, not only the swap of the defensive pairing where Dickinson finds himself with Liljegren and Mukhamadullin finds himself with Orlov, but their ice time shrinks considerably. Dickinson only ends up with about 11.5 minutes here tonight. Mukhamadullin does get a decent bit more, but that is because he played a decent bit of time on the penalty kill in terms of even strength. He only actually had a couple more minutes of even strength ice time, and this was a situation where Ryan Warsofsky, despite, the 3-goal lead, the 4-goal lead that the Sharks had, he didn't feel comfortable enough having either of these two players on the ice on any sort of consistent basis. And the thing is that they did get a few more shifts after this play happened, but we saw some shakiness from both of these players, showing that they were not actually bouncing back. And this is unfortunately the environment that Ryan Warsofsky has cultivated for his young defensemen. This environment of, if you make a mistake, you're coming out of the lineup, you're going to sit on the bench. And that gets your young defenseman into a position where they start feeling a lot less confident and a lot more nervous about their game. Mukhamadullin and Dickinson, can you imagine just how much sort of I won't say fear, but just kind of nervousness after making a mistake like that they won't be in the lineup for the next game? And remember, NHL players, they want to play every single game. They don't want to be sitting out on the sidelines, even if the coach has a good justification for the situation. They want to be on the ice, they want to be in game action, and yet making a mistake like that, they're probably feeling like, hey, like our spot is in jeopardy, we have to try to clean this up. And when you start to overthink, you start to make more mistakes. And so obviously, you could sit here and blame both of these players for not having good games. And indeed, I thought Shakir Mukhamadullin did a slightly better job cleaning up, and especially I thought he was actually pretty effective on the Sharks' penalty kill. Dickinson was a little bit rougher around the edges, especially in the immediate moments leading after this goal against. But the fact is that this is kind of a situation by Warsofsky's own design, and you could even say by extension by Mike Greer's own design, by having so many defensemen on this roster, that they have put their two young players into a spot where they don't feel comfortable at this point in the lineup. When it comes to the Sharks goaltender, here we had Yaroslav Askarov. Now, he lets in 3 goals, which for Askarov standards is a little bit higher than usual, but I still thought he was pretty good here tonight. This first goal from Lawson Krause, he has absolutely zero chance on. The second goal from Lawson Krause, he also has a pretty low chance of actually being able to make the save. The only one that I would say he maybe could have had was the goal from JJ Peterka, but even that, this was an extremely impressive shot. I would say, it is not many players who are going to be able to pick that corner all that consistently, and yet Peterka was able to do it in that moment. But Askarov otherwise made a lot of pretty key saves for the San Jose Sharks. Certainly not his best game, but he did enough for sure to claim the victory here for the team. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Wednesday. They'll be taking on the Washington Capitals. The Capitals, record-wise, have not necessarily had the best start of the season, certainly not like what they did last year, but they have actually had some pretty solid underlying numbers. They're getting some really good performances from players like Ovechkin, who seems to just be the ageless wonder when it comes to at least scoring goals. Jacob Chychrun has been one of the best defensemen in the entire NHL. Logan Thompson has been one of the best goaltenders in the entire NHL. And so the Sharks will definitely have their work cut out for them, and we'll see if they can carry the momentum from this game into that one. Class dismissed.